And let's see here. This icon you can see floating around me is just a sign of the quicksilver flask I'm using in order to move matters along more quickly. We've passed that spiral again, and here's a bronze monograph, which is a entirely different sort of thing. So let's play the dialogue here, but oh, interesting. The bronze monograph is on this little pedestal, and it's got the same sort of cherub-like head that we also saw in that relief of someone being tortured, so I wonder if those are related. But let's go. So, this is all about the trials of ascendancy, which will let us into the labyrinth in Act 3, which will be a little while. You can see the goddess standing here in this relief on the bronze doorway. She's a kind of Greek sort of inspired figure. Long hair and kind of spirally plaits, holding up two cups, presumably for justice or weighing. She's got stars behind her, and some interesting iconography going on. So the deal here is that one of the last emperors of Sarn, Izaro, died without issue. He couldn't have any kids. Not really clear what the dealie was there. I personally kind of like the idea that he might have been trans, actually, but that's, of course, completely unconfirmed in this particular setting. Not because there aren't trans people, just because, it hasn't come up. So in order to choose his successor, he decided to do it in a particularly brutal merit-based selection. He set up this elaborate labyrinth full of traps, and whoever could survive their passage through would be the new ruler. Many people tried and, of course, died along the way, and their reanimated remains made the path more dangerous. But, the person who did manage it, it was actually a pair that made it all the way to the last dungeon. There was someone called the Ezemite, and Cheetus Parandus. Cheetus sounding like cheater, probably on purpose. TBF. So, Ezemir is one of the countries in the setting that we haven't been to yet, but which comes up periodically. It seems to be sort of a Scottish XP. Has a strong focus on poetry as a way to record deeds. Seems to have a strong emphasis on oral history and artistry in that way. Also has a clan-based structure and evidently some interesting wolf-based primordial gods as well. So, Ezemir is an interesting thing, and the Ezemite of the Labyrinth was a great, strong, brave warrior, whereas Cheetus Parandus was, we're gonna say, the clever one. He figured out ways to get them through the traps and to navigate relatively safely, but right before the final challenge to make their way to the throne, he poisoned the Ezemite's dinner, and the Ezemite ended up dying right there in the last chamber. And meanwhile, Cheetus Parandus, of course, became emperor. The very last emperor of Sarn as it was. And he was incredibly wealthy, and incredibly debauched. He promoted the kind of thaumaturgy and alchemy that, we're gonna call it just mad science. It involved a lot of human experimentation, a lot of theologically problematic behavior, and there ended up being a multifaceted uprising against the reign of Cheetahs Parandus, led by Vol, the Emperor of Purity, among some other folks who will come up later, including Thane Rigwald, the then ruler of Ezimir. And they ended up overthrowing him, but his chief thaumaturgist, Malachi, managed to make his way into the new regime by making great promises to Vol, Emperor of Purity. And his experiments ended up leading to the apocalypse, which caused the ruin of the Eternal Empire, and whose repercussions are still causing problems in Rayclass today, and are probably the reason the dead are rising, and there are horrible storms that drive people crazy and stuff. So, backstory there. Izaro, find a better way to pick your new ruler. But, it seems likely from the setting that, Izaro's faith in a goddess of justice was what led him to take that route in the succession. And his faith in his goddess, either she was already real or his faith made her real. And he ended up being resurrected after his own death to continue to guard the labyrinth and choose a worthy successor to the Empire, which, you know, given the kind of game this is, it's us. But I think he's a particularly interesting tragic figure in the setting, because the man tried. He really tried. It didn't go well. And on the, at the moment that Cheetahs Parandus won, he cast Izaro back into the labyrinth, as was his right as the Emperor, and caused Izaro's death. So, just generally a big mess. Cheetahs Parandus, huge jerk. Honestly, most of the Parandus family, huge jerks. You're gonna see Janus Parandus later, and, as you might guess from a man named after a two-faced god, he's a jerk. We'll also be seeing Kadiro Parandus, who is, more amoral than a complete jerk, but still kind of problematic. Kadiro Parandus managed to survive the apocalypse by pledging his loyalty to a god of wealth, and his immense fortunes were commended unto that god, so he's trying to recover all of his coins and treasures, presumably to buy his freedom or something like that, or maybe just because he's a butt. But, the Parandus family in general have always relied more upon their wealth and power than upon their actual merit. It'll be a while until we see Kadiro Parandus, which is why I mention him, because it's not going to come up anytime soon. He was a major figure in, I think, the Parandus League, naturally, but, he only appears in certain maps now, which is very endgame content. So he's still in the game, but he's fairly rare to actually encounter, and certainly not until much farther along than we are. So, there's an upper and a lower prison, and we're now in the upper prison, so we'll be getting to Brutus's lovely lair relatively soon. We're also running into, rather than prisoners, we're running into Axiom Thunder Guards quite often. And obviously, in gameplay terms, they're spellcasters, they have ranged damage, they have elemental damage, so they're generally a bit more dangerous, but also, it seems strongly implied that something happened that killed off not just the prisoners in the lower prison, but most of the guards, who I think we've seen some of their resting areas. Like there's a table here which presumably would have been used by the guards for dinner and hanging out. Here's another dining table. We're running into more furniture as we move along and more guards, so presumably the upper prison did include prisoners, but also was more the quarters of the guards themselves. And here we've got another of these ridiculously large caverns, which seems like it might be flooded with water. The texture's not quite clear, and we've got some more folks in cages who've perished, hanging off the edge. All lovely stuff out here, but I do want to note that it is much less gross than Diablo 3. Like, if you look carefully at what's going on, like this chain of 3 people who have been suspended by their wrists from a wall, and each of them is missing the right leg, that suggests some things happened. And it could just be the reuse of texture, but honestly, given how common it has been historically to remove specific limbs as a punishment for crime, or as a torture method prior to execution, I would guess that that is related, given its remarkable consistency in this particular case. Also interesting that at least some of the guards seem to have been spellcasters, which seems like a lot to put into a prison like this. Even a major prison, why would you use your spellcasters as guards rather than using them for the defense of Lionized Watch and in the army? Maybe Brutus was able to call them to him, or maybe something happened that made these people capable of magic after their death, and they were imbued with elemental power. Also, another mini-boss, another necromancer called Sawbones, which is itself interesting. I've mentioned the necromancers wear plague doctor masks. So, Sawbones could be reference to torture, of course. Could also be that this was the doctor of the establishment who has gone mad in death. Or, other possibilities too, but it's some interesting nonsense. And now we're coming up on the warden's quarters right here. We've got even more blood traces. We've got some bare bloody footprints, which are, at least twice as big as mine. We have the ripped off lower arm of what's definitely a Sarnish soldier. So let's go see what happened here, because Brutus is a very scary boy, and Brutus is very unhappy at having his territory invaded. We're seeing more. Yep. Yep, more Blackguard soldiers, and here's Piety, who's running this particular campaign. So Piety is a recurring figure, especially in the first part here. She's saying, you are so much more capable of learning magic and being horrifying here in Rayclass than you were in Oriath, with a relatively comfortable village life. She also has a interesting costume in that it is quite cleavage-bearing, but her head is basically covered, almost like she's a nun or a chess piece. And I say this because I know you're not actually watching, dear, so later notes. We've made our way here to Chevron's lab, which seems to be a large repurposed cell just off of the warden's quarters. There's fairly destroyed bookshelves, a writing desk, a brazier. It seems like it was a fairly comfortable and well-appointed little research lab for a while. Oh, here's an astrolabe. Fancy. I don't know why there's so many astrolabes. I assume there must be some emphasis on astrology among the traditional thaumaturgists of Sarn. But we've also got her journal, so let's play that. So here we have a different picture of what actually happened in Axiom Prison with Brutus and Chevron. And Chevron is basically saying, I was doing research here before, but the reason that I have transformed Brutus into a great and terrible monster is because we're losing the fight against the Kadui. They have destroyed everything from this whole act. Every mark of Sarnish inhabitation has been destroyed. And he's the last line of defense as they beat a fighting retreat. So, it's a more nuanced view than Nessa was apparently taught in Theopolis, in that she was just taught that hubris is terrible and not, presumably, about how the Sarnish forces were badly losing, and this was a act of desperation as much as anything. Also, Chevron was full of hubris, but I'm not sure how much the people of Theopolis were taught about just how desperate their situation was. And, next to a dead Blackguard soldier, we have this here, so let's play it. So that's Dominus, the head of the theocracy in Oriath again. And he's making it fairly clear that he does not completely trust Piety, I think. He's pretty much outright saying, keep an eye on her. And it's particularly interesting that this particular Blackguard soldier seems to have died sitting down without a mark on him, as if perhaps he was poisoned or had a slow wound that ended up killing him rather than being ripped apart physically by Brutus. And also, there's a reference to, let's see. The Inquisitor, the Umbra, and the Soulless One. So that's a trio of scientists, and it's interesting that Dominus knows that these three are important, because they're going to come up later. They were some of the most preeminent thaumaturgists of the time immediately before the apocalypse and the fall of Sarn. They were disciples of Malachi, the chief thaumaturgist I've mentioned to you before, and made some questionable life decisions, usually involving incredibly unethical human experimentation and hubris and all kinds of craziness. But it's interesting that their names are still known, at least by Dominus, and their general significance. And I think that what Piety is up to here is trying to learn the secrets of late Sarnish thaumaturgy in order to gain greater power for her own people and perhaps retake Rayclast itself and undo the apocalypse, or at least make it manageable for her own forces. So, let's head into the Warden's Chambers. I should say also, the level design of the Warden's Chambers is really striking. It's unlike every other place we've been so far, other than town, of course. It's completely devoid of enemies. It's just this bloody smear where clearly a still living body has been dragged along the floor with giant footprints alongside it. Giant bloody footprints leading right into the Warden's Chambers. And that was darn spooky the first time I saw it, because I was just waiting for the next enemy to show up, and nothing. If you couldn't catch that, that was, you will know my misery, come and share it with me. And here we get to see the mutilated Brutus. He's wearing a loincloth and a lot of metal straps that seem to be holding him together. He's maybe twice the height and width of a man. It's also always been interesting to me that Brutus is not depicted as a young or a pretty man. He's middle-aged, at least. I love the witch. And he ends up just exploding on death. So, we can see corpses all around his chamber of various ages. Both brand new ones and just piles of skeletons and rotting corpses that have made it through putrefaction. All of them seeming to have horrified looks on their faces. And the one who was dragged along seems to have been decapitated right here in the chamber. So, Brutus, not a nice dude. He's pretty renowned for the brutality, naturally, of the punishments which he foisted upon his prisoners. In some ways, he's as much evidence of the debauchery of the late Sarnish Empire as the thaumaturgists were. So I think that juxtaposition is pretty interesting as a picture of what the end of Sarn looked like. That Brutus might have been a victim in some ways, but he was also very much a part of the problem. So we have this letter of instruction. So these are the first words from Malachi, this chief thaumaturgist that we've heard. And clearly Chevron was working on this augmentation process to begin with. But she is trying to accelerate it. I would guess that Lioneye is saying, hey, we can't hold, we need to fall back to Axiom Prison. We need presumably your guards and your mages to help us hold the position or we won't be able to. But Chevron has already locked onto the augmentation of Brutus as what's going to save the day. Would be my guess, anyway. And the process of implanting these virtue gems, these skill gems into people is pretty gnarly. You need to cut them open, boil the gem in blood and a powerful explosive for a very specific amount of time and then shove it into the body. And clearly it makes a person grow to monstrous size in this particular case and monstrous strength and possibly go mad, or although possibly he was already a huge jerk. Not really clear. So yeah. We have that particular bit of information. There's also a couple reliefs right at the doorway too, right in the warden's chambers where he clearly wanted to be looking at them. Gnarly dude. One being the relief with several cherubs apparently torturing someone, and another similar one which looks like it has a bone saw. So that's pleasant. There also seem to be actual cracks in the stonework of the floor, especially near the entrance, but all through this particular chamber, which I don't think we've seen before. In other areas, I think it was just brickwork. But as we go toward the entrance, it seems like Brutus's tantrums had him fracturing the very rock, possibly in an attempt to get out, as well as destroying all of the furniture and leaving it in shreds, and of course, any people he had access to, too. So, oh yeah, this is definitely a dead guard, mummified with a helmet still on him. A Sarnish design rather than the Blackguard's uniform of Piety's forces. So presumably his augmentation was done right before they beat their retreat out through Prisoner's Gate, and any stragglers who moved too slowly were just slaughtered by Brutus. So isn't that fun? Let's head out through Prisoner's Gate quick. Ooh, we've got some more nice cherubim. Wonder if we'll see this more in Sarn, but these ones actually have wings and are pretty much in the usual style. They look like they're kind of serving as protective deities, maybe. It's much more ornamental than we've seen before, although we do have the symbol I've mentioned before as the symbol of innocence of the theocratic Oriathan religion and the god that is mentioned periodically here. Along with a number of rusted metal spikes that outline the doorway almost like a sun, and also the walls and go above the doorway as well. And we've also got more rusted out cages with people in them. But as we head down a cliff here, we're back into the natural landscape, just a little way from the sea, but it seems to be some dusty soil that's reminiscent of the sand that we've been crossing. We've got more goatmen. We've also got some hellions, which, according to the bestiary, are technically feline, so I think they are hyenas of some sort. They make the ground burn when they die, which is, like, a little gnarly. Kind of a pain in the neck if you're not ready for it, honestly. But these are flame hellions here. And we also have a relatively well-maintained road. It's not a cobblestone road in the Roman style, which I find interesting. Perhaps Sarn at its height never had the kind of power or respect for uniformity that we saw in the Romans. There's definitely large rocks that would have taken work to shape and put into place, and there's a pretty uniform carved border to the road, but the thickness and the size of the rocks varies wildly, which adds some visual interest, but honestly I'm a little surprised they didn't go for cobble with the Roman influence that late Sarn often seems to have, or sometimes it's a little more Byzantine, but Sarn has always pinged me as a very Roman society, at least in the later period. Yep, and we have the Burning Menace, a particularly gnarly, largely skeletal hellion, where you can see just the bones and muscles chillin', throwing fire at me. Thanks, bruh. It's a pretty good model, though. His eyes are, even in death, burning with flame, and just a skeletal head. It's some gnarly stuff. We have bearded shamans. These ones are lightning throwing. And as we proceed down the King's Road, which is what this particular pathway is called, at least was called, running into more things, but we'll... there we go. I love that Piety calls me sister. But what we've run into is the thaumatic seal that Chevron mentioned before. It's a magical barrier of spikes that's impassable and guards the road ahead, which Chevron used to block off the Karui forces from following the Sarnish forces along, or at least that was her plan. She might not have made it there before she died, but I haven't seen any signs of Karui inhabitation either, so it might have been that things didn't go as planned for either side. Regardless, Piety has blocked off the path here. She clearly also identifies as a witch, or identifies us as a thaumaturgist. She seems to have some friendly feeling toward other maligned women trying to make it through the world, which I've always really appreciated, honestly. I think that is an interesting aspect of Piety's character, that she does seem to feel that kinship even though she is a horrible monster, and that she is clearly scarred by her own experience and trying to demonstrate strength and threat because that's the only way she feels that she can be safe and make it through the world. Hi, sweetie.
I brought you your secretary.
Oh, thank you, dear. I'm talking to you on the internet.
I know.
Well, I hope you're entertained.
I am. I thought your little secretary would like to spend a little time with you while you're doing this.
She is a sweet pie.
Mm-hmm.
I figured I'd keep from waking you up.
Oh yeah, it's appreciated.
It's love.
I'm gonna start making dinner now.
Alright, love you, dearie. I'll be out soon.
No worries. I figured that I'd leave you a little time with those since,
She doesn't get to hang in here too often. Does she want to leave? Oh, she often just rolls around near the floor. So I think Ungulath here, this goat man who's another mini-boss, he's got a bit of unique texture, but I wonder if he's a priest of Aberoth, the cloven god that Tarkley mentioned before. You will understand this when you actually watch the videos.
I can't wait.
It's very weird to be talking to two of you at once, but hey.
I'm just in the background giving Seth switches so that she'll be cozy and happy.
I also like the manes on these Hellions. I'm still not really clear on whether they're hyenas or not, but since they are felids, I presume so. And it does seem like their bodies burn on death, so it's hard to get a really great look at them, but they are some interesting monstrosities. I'm not sure we ever really get much lore for them. Ooh, scorpion. Tiny scorpion friend. As opposed to giant scorpion not friend, which we will see much later. And all of these goat men, presumably weren't here during the height of Sarn, so I wonder where they originally came from, if they originally inhabited this area, or if they've moved in from elsewhere since the fall of Sarn, because Tarkley seems pretty knowledgeable about them, but we don't see anything about them in the Sarnish documents, I think. Clearly their god has existed for some time, though, because the whole cycle of godly death and rebirth has been kind of suspended for a while because of shenanigans we'll get into much later.
I remember some of the shenanigans.
Oh, yes.
I
Well,
look forward to following them in semi-real time.
well, we'll get there before too long. But, since the thaumatic seal has been, set up by Piety so that we can't take the King's Road along the shoreline to the forest, which would be awfully convenient, or instead following an alternate route to the ship graveyard, which I should probably go up to town soon because, everyone's gonna have feelings about the ship graveyard, specifically that this is a terrible idea. The sirens appear to be dying as well. We are back on the coast here. It's kind of an eerie shade of green with will-o-wisps floating through the air. Not enemies, just motes of light.
Oh, it's pretty.
Oh yeah, I love the ship graveyard. Don't you like how this hull looks like a...
Bones?
Yeah,
Ribs?
yeah, looks like a rib cage. We also see some whale or plesiosaur skeletons elsewhere, which,
I look forward to that.
oh yes, it's quite neat.
The texture of the waves is pretty nice too.
Oh yeah.
Nice and realistic.
Mm-hmm.
Necromancer again?
I mean, yeah. Look, I wanted to do a lore run, which means I want to be able to get close enough to enemies to really zoom in on the models and look at them. And you don't want me to be fussing around with whether my build is going to work while I'm rambling on.
What are you playing? Who are you playing?
The Witch. Love the Witch.
Yes, who are they named after?
Oh, well, this one is just called Blight Lore, but honestly,
yeah.
I normally make my witches Marion, and you know it.
Oh, yeah.
How do I make these work? Well, anyway, you can see here that this little axe is of Karui construction. It's got jade strapped to basically a wooden club, so that sort of thing should be surviving for extended periods. At least the napped jade should be surviving pretty well. Love you, dearie. Be back soon. We've also got some merc runners, which are clearly another kind of feral roa. And we've got quite a few seafarer ghosts, which, since we are right up against the water, presumably this was a particularly treacherous cove that lots and lots of people died in. So isn't that cheery? We've got neat old partially destroyed ship hulls of all shapes and sizes, some of which have been split open so that they end up looking like rib cages as they've been dashed upon the rocks. It's all a very thematic landscape. We've also got some very lovely lichen and similar plant life. I do wish that the textures on the plants were a little more 3D, but, you know, that's not the kind of thing you necessarily want to waste your polygons on in a game like this. If you're running limited anyway. They're pretty, though. And, we've got a spot of lore here, another weathered carving from the Karui invasion. So the Karui have gone directly off the deep end. They're now engaging in cannibalism because they believe it's the only way to gain back the favor of their gods. And if the king, who is revered and clearly wonderful, says that this is necessary, then clearly it must be, right? In actuality, everyone's gone crazy. And knowing, as we do, what the cannibals of Raycast look like and are possessed by, I think you can gather that it's only making things worse. There's also no real note on exactly who was sacrificed, but clearly not a good idea. So, in addition, we have a relatively well-preserved, still floating ship with some lanterns on it, and a apparently living human figure with a lot of pockets. Another sailor marked as Captain Fairgraves. So, here we have some very Age of Discovery nonsense going on, and I would hazard a guess that the boat that we see here is a frigate of 17th century, 18th century sort of style. Certainly, Fairgraves is wearing a tricorn and what seems like 18th century clothing. And he is bringer of civilization to untamed lands. And yes, this does mean that he went to places like Ngama Kanui, or Ngama Karui, sorry, hard to pronounce, and did very nasty colonial things there. The Karui do not like the man at all. We don't know anything further yet about the flesh pits of Trarthus, but presumably they're not nice, and yeah, no kidding, your slave girl left as soon as she thought she could get away with it. We also know that the All Flame was found in a forgotten cathedral deep in the Inner Empire. I would actually hazard a guess that that might have been an old Asmeri or even Valish settlement. Fairgraves is not a reliable narrator, especially because the All Flame itself might be distorting what he sees, but it's presumably some kind of very powerful thaumaturgy that's capable of great destruction and presumably doing something to power his sails, although he might just be seeing it as a good luck charm that in actuality is just driving people crazy and running them aground forever. So isn't that fun? And it's incapable of consuming pure silver, which suggests to me that we might be pulling on some old myths about silver being a pure metal and reflecting evil away from it and being naturally opposed to it. Kind of hard to say there. So, Merveille. This is the first reference to her. We'll hear more about her in town, but all of the tentacled monsters, the half fish, half octopus things we've been running into, they're the progeny of Merveille. And she has a magical necklace which horribly transformed her. We'll get the whole story in a little bit, a couple levels on from here. But she used to be human, now she is a horrible tentacle monster. Basically because virtue gems are not very virtuous at all. And pretty much everyone is going to tell us, stay away from Merveille, she will shank you. You will die. But, you know, we're the protagonist. We're going right in there anyway. So we'll be hearing quite a bit more about Merveille later. She She really didn't do anything wrong. She was given a basically cursed artifact by her beloved who had no idea what it was, and it ended badly for everybody. But this being said, we'll run into her a wee bit later on, about 2 levels from now. She's very upset that Duresso was looking for a cure to her horrible, tentacly insane state rather than staying for the birth of her horrible, tentacly children. Which, I mean, you kind of can't blame her, but also you can. Complicated. I think that what this says also is that Duresso may have been rather later than I was remembering, because if he was Oriathan and Rayclast itself was heavily problematic, then presumably he was after the fall of Sarn, or at least somewhere around that period, and Merveil as well. Because, of course, during the Sarnish Empire, people just, lived here. It was a relatively normal place, at least for a time. So yeah. I think that's about what we know there. Poor Merveil. Really, she didn't do anything wrong. So if I remember correctly, Heidi is, I think Calm's daughter or his niece. She ends up leading the Karui after this. And presumably Calm took the male warriors. In Karui society, the men traditionally do the melee combat and women engage in archery, which makes a certain level of sense, I guess. So Heidi's archers will appear later in a few different kinds of forms. But this is when everyone realizes Calm wasn't divinely inspired. Calm was crazy. And the black spirit here, they don't really specify whether that's the same Kitava or Kitava that Navali has mentioned, the ever-hungry god that at the end will consume the world. It seems possible that that's what they assume, but it might also be that they're just referring to the black storms that they've been encountering. And, right at the end of this map, we have another lovely whale or plesiosaur or similar skull, and a fin, and a rib cage that leads to the Cavern of Wrath. But before we hit that, we'll be hitting the ship graveyard cave, which is going to be where we'll find the All-Flame and bring Fairgraves, the artifact he apparently requires to stop being a horrible thaumaturgy-spawned revenant. He does look entirely like a normal person, but, you saw that was ominous, right? That he's a big jerk? He's a big jerk. But, since we've been going for a little while, I think I'll call this part here and pick up a little later.